Welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast, where each week we're exploring what it means to be an unstuck church. When it comes to creating a great experience for new people visiting our church, one of the most often overlooked resources is our facility. From parking to lobby space and even restrooms, we can unintentionally create a negative experience only because we're personally so used to our space. On this week's podcast, Tony and Amy continue our series on common mistakes churches make on the weekend with a conversation about the 5 mistakes churches make when it comes to their space. If you're new to the Unstuck Church podcast, stop before you listen and head to theunstuckgroup.com/podcast and subscribe to get the show notes in your email. When you do, each week you'll get resources to support that week's episode, including our Leader Conversation Guide, as well as access to our podcast resource archive. That's theunstuckgroup.com/podcast to subscribe. Now, before this week's conversation, here's Tony.
The Church Lawyers Client Member Program was created for organizations just like yours. Their team of Christian legal professionals are personally called to empower and protect churches, ministries, and their leaders. They want to help you fulfill your mission by providing biblically informed and ministry-focused legal solutions. Whether it's governance, employment, litigation, or other matters, let the church lawyers walk alongside you as you navigate legal issues facing your ministry. Sign up for the Church Lawyers Client Member Program today at thechurchlawyers.com.
Well, welcome back. Tony, good to see you again today. How's your travel schedule been?
It's been good. I was out in Denver. The mountains were big out there. It's a good place to go visit. However, it was hot in Denver, hotter than it was in Atlanta. So
Really?
I don't know what's going on, but it was. But I was with a great church, Crossroads Church. Pastor Matt Manning's good friend has become a good friend of mine, and they're doing great ministry. There's actually a story related to Crossroads that I want to share at some point related to some key transitions that they made in recent years, but we're going to hold that for a future podcast episode, Amy. But they're doing great ministry, and it was just fun to reconnect with the team out at Crossroads Church.
I love that you bring them up because if I remember right, they were the first church once the pandemic hit that said, nope, we're going to move forward and start our planning. And so I'm excited to share that story because they did a lot of hard work the last couple of years.
They absolutely did.
Well, this week we're in part 3 of our series on mistakes you're making in your weekend experience. And so far we've talked about the 5 mistakes you might be making in your weekend worship experience and in your guest experience. But Tony, where's our conversation headed today?
Yeah, Amy, I'm looking forward to sharing today's interview because this episode is going to be focused on our physical space and facilities. This is another area that we look at in our secret shopper reports. We talk about parking spaces, signage, the facility itself, the quality of the coffee. No, I'm kidding. We don't talk about coffee, though we do appreciate a good cup of coffee, don't we?
We do. And, this is one area where small changes can make a big difference. And we've talked about this before. We habituate to our environments and we just don't see it anymore. And so those fresh eyes, that outsider perspective really helps to identify what are those small changes or sometimes big changes that need to be made. And so to help us with today's topic, we have a guest joining us today. Tony, can you tell us about him?
Yeah, I recently got the chance to sit down with Phil Taylor from PlainJoe Studios. It's a design studio for nonprofits and churches. And I thought, man, his wisdom would be so helpful for this topic. So Phil understands it. He understands both sides of the conversation. He'll talk about that in a minute because he actually served previously as an executive and lead pastor for several churches over 20 years before he started to work at PlainJoe. But now he's shifted out of full-time ministry and gets to help churches tell their stories more effectively through his work as the executive producer at PlainJoe Studios. And I enjoyed our conversation, and I think you will as well. It's very practical. So listen to my conversation with Phil Taylor. Phil, I'm really glad to have you in the conversation today. We're talking about mistakes that churches make around their weekend experiences. And with you, I wanted to focus in on facilities because you're the executive producer at Storyland Studios, part of PlainJoe. Maybe a little bit of your backstory before we jump into the conversation, though.
Yeah, sure. So I spent 20 years as a pastor, most of that time as an executive pastor. And of course, along the way, got into some facilities projects and expansions. And actually, I was on the client side. So I hired PlainJoe Studios to work on a big box store that we were converting into our new home as a church, and they came in and what we were most concerned about was that we didn't want to end up with a 78,000 square foot dentist office that was just boring and had no story to it, and kind of the decor gets left to the last minute and everybody kind of just fends for themselves, and it ends up being a hodgepodge with no consistent or clear story. And so we brought Plain Joe in to say, hey, make this place sing, make it look awesome, make it reflect who we are. And they did an incredible job of that. That created a friendship, and then I was able to. They asked me to join the team a few years later and help lots of churches do that around the country. And so that's been a blast to be able to come alongside of pastors and help them tell their story well.
I'm glad that you and the team at Plain Joe are doing that, because I will just tell you, when I walk into a church, I can tell when a building committee has been responsible for the
Mm-hmm.
facility and the interior design and so on, because usually it's as bland as you can imagine. There's no creativity. It's not telling any kind of a story. And so I really appreciate experts like you that are coming alongside churches, coming alongside pastors, because we don't do buildings for a living. We do ministry, and you're helping us engage that mission much more effectively. So, all that as a precursor to you and I were talking a little bit. We had a little bit back and forth on what we thought the 5 common mistakes were that we're seeing related to facilities and churches. And so, I'm just going to kind of lead you through some of the pre conversation that we have and walk through these 5 mistakes that we identified. The first being around directional signage, or think about brand consistency, too much insider language. In other words, it feels like churches aren't creating a clear and cohesive experience. So,
Yeah,
what do you
yeah.
think about that?
So we'll call that wayfinding signage, right? And really what we're trying to do is, I'm new to your church. It's my first time there, and I'm walking in from the parking lot. One, do I know where your building is? Is the signage clear to get me to your building? Once I get to your parking lot, can I figure out what the main entrance is that I'm supposed to walk through? Is there a different entrance for parents with kids that I don't know about? And now I'm walking halfway through the building to check my kids into kids ministry. Do I walk in and maybe I got there late and I'm like a little lost, or maybe it took a little longer to get there and I just really need to go to the bathroom and I can't find the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of these things are simple to solve. And really, if you think about it, when you're new at a church, like there can be a lot of anxiety there. You feel out of place. It's not it's not a place of comfort for you because you're new. You don't know the building, and so just alleviating a lot of that, I think, is a good gospel thing to do, where you can alleviate that stress with just some simple, clear signage where the font is big enough that I can read it across the lobby and I can see where I need to go. And if you put yourself in the eyes of a visitor and you say, how does the visitor experience this building? Where do they need to turn? What do they need to find? It's not hard to do that. And then just giving it a consistent look. So it shouldn't be a different color than your colors that you use in your font package and whatnot, right? Or in your logo style guide. It should all feel like it hangs together, having that cohesive experience from the parking lot all the way to the chair, the pew, whatever, and having it all feel like it hangs together. It's not hard. It's not super expensive to do that well in any building, existing building, brand new building. It's not hard at all to do.
So that kind of leads to the second mistake. And I think it's just related to, for those of us that are already part of the church, when we walk into our church buildings, we know where everything is, and it looks like church is supposed to look. For new people, they come in with fresh eyes and different perspective on how they're engaging our facilities, because it's an experience that they've not had before. And I've seen this also play out as it relates to, just it feels like a lot of the church buildings I walk into just feel tired. It feels like they're becoming dated. And I think many times pastors and church leaders, because they're living in that space all the time, they don't realize it themselves. A few years ago, I travel. Obviously, I'm on the road 3 times a month visiting churches. stay in a lot of hotels, primarily in the Marriott chain of some
Yep,
sort.
me too.
And I thought I read someplace that Marriott actually has all of their hotel properties on maybe a 5 or 6 year cycle where they're doing renovations. And I thought, I think churches need to do that, because even some of our newer church buildings built within the last decade or so, even those newer buildings are feeling a little bit tired and dated. Do you find that as well, Phil?
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of funny. You can go into a Marriott hotel, and you could tell, like in a say a Fairfield Inn and Suites, you could tell like within about a 2 year period when it was built, right?
Yeah.
Or when it was last renovated. Like, oh, it's got that couch, like you just got to know. Uh, but yeah, I think in churches, when you're designing, let's say it's a new building, when you're designing that lobby space, think of those common spaces that everybody has to walk through to get to the sanctuary or the kids ministry area. If when you're designing it, like literally from day one, you're saying, okay, what does it take to update this, right? So I'll give you an example of one building I was working on where there was an accent color that was used in maybe 10 places throughout the lobby. It was a large lobby, probably 20,000 square feet. It was for a big church. And so there was this accent color that was used in maybe 10 or 12 places. And then there was some vinyl based graphics that were used in 8 or 9 places. And then there was some wayfinding signage hanging down from the ceiling, really simple Sintra board, cheap stuff, easy to make. And that was in half a dozen places. And so we looked at that and we said, okay, let's say in 5 years' time, you want to give this whole lobby a fresh look. You change out the accent colors, you change out the vinyl signage, and you change out the hanging wayfind signage, and you're probably going to spend absolute max 20K, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolute max. And then just, go downwards if you're in a smaller church, 5K, right?
Yeah.
So is that worth it to give your whole building? You don't have to update the whole building every time, right? You update the common areas. You come up with a new paint scheme. So it's not hard to stay somewhat current, and then you do some deep changes. Maybe every 15 or 20 years you might make some major changes. But if you're staying up on that and you plan for it ahead of time, it doesn't have to be crazy. The place where people get into trouble is when they do something really unique and different, like with the flooring, right? And then
Yeah.
you're like, well, now you're screwed, because that's going to be dated in 2.5 years, and you're going to have to spend $100,000 to fix that. So
That's right. All right. So around the third mistake, you were using this phrase placemaking. Can you help me understand when you say placemaking, what does that mean, and
yeah.
where do you see this as being an opportunity for churches?
So placemaking, if you think about this, is let's say I were to walk into your church on Sunday morning, and God forbid, not a single person speaks to me. Right? Your greeting team is just they all called in sick that day, and all the pastors are on vacation, and there's only one guy, and just I walk in and I walk around for 10 minutes before the service starts and 10 minutes after the service ends, and not a single person talks to me, and for whatever reason, it doesn't bother me. So, what am I going to learn about your church by just walking around those common spaces, the lobbies, the hallway to the kids' ministry check in area, whatever it might be? What am I going to learn about your church just by doing that? That's placemaking, right? And that can happen through a few different things. One of the biggest areas is the graphics that are on the wall. So maybe it's, a big, graphic that covers this whole big wall when you first walk into the lobby, and it's got some imagery. Maybe it's got the phrase that you use to kind of define your church all the time, but it's up there big. It's really clear. I want you to see this. I want you to read this. This is important about us. Maybe I turn the corner of the lobby and I see a big kids check-in area, and it's beautiful and colorful, and kids see it and they go, I don't know what that is, but I want to go there. What are you
Hmm.
telling me? You're telling me that kids are important. So you're doing placemaking with the kids ministry check-in area. Maybe there's a wall that is talking about student ministry or global missions, or whatever it is that your church is into. If I can walk around the lobby and I can see 2 or 3 spotlight graphic areas that are really helping me to understand what this church is all about, then you're doing a good job at placemaking. The other thing that plays into that is the furniture choices that you make. So, if I walk into your 1970s building, and you've kind of lovingly fixed it up, and you've maybe leaned into that mid-century modern thing that's super popular right now. And I walk in and I go, man, this feels like, the Starbucks I love to go to. It's you're doing good placemaking at that point, right? You've done a good job with furniture selection. Are you telling a consistent story with that? Does the trash can look like it, came from Lowe's, or does it look like it came from a proper design store and therefore
Yeah.
fits in with everything else you've purchased, right? This is a lot of what we talk about when we talk about placemaking.
Yeah, and I think it gets to, buildings need to be functional. They need to
Mhm.
serve a certain purpose, but you're trying to create a certain emotional reaction almost in the space as well. Isn't that correct?
That's right. Yeah, you want people to walk into a space and kind of instantly have a sense of kind of who you are as a church, right? So
Hmm.
if you've got, this great brand new, building that that just feels plain and ugly, right? So like it's a good space in terms of the size, but it feels more like the rec hall for the city rather than a
Hmm.
place where somebody would make a church home. What do we always say as pastors? We say, "Hey, well, welcome to the church." If you call blank church your home, right? We use that language all the time. If you call this church your home, okay, well, if we want to talk about church as a home, there ought to be some touches of a home as we walk around. It ought to feel a little bit like your actual home, not just this building that's your home on Sunday morning. And so you got to really think that through. And that's an emotional experience, right? Storytelling.
Very, very much so. Yeah, very much so. All right. So the fourth mistake is not building the right size building. And there are two directions, and I want to maybe spend a little bit of time on both sides of this. I've seen churches that have underbuilt, and I've seen churches that have overbuilt. And let's talk about the underbuilt churches. This is what I've seen, Phil, and maybe you can help us understand how Plain Joe helps churches around this too. Sometimes, many times, I've run into churches where they have a good number of seats for the church, but then based on the number of seats, the parking lot might meet code, but it's not supporting their seating capacity. The kid space isn't designed to accommodate the number
Hmm.
of adults that they have. The lobby space is inadequate, and just I don't know, there's probably a technical term for this, but the people movement in the building because of the
Yeah.
size of the
Yeah.
hallways is just not adequate for the number of seats that they have built in their auditorium or sanctuary. So all that to say, I find that some churches are underbuilding for the crowd that they're expecting at any given time on a Sunday morning. So how
Right.
do you help churches with that?
Yeah, so like you said, there really are three areas where you're going to run into capacity issues. There's the sanctuary seats available. There's the amount of capacity you have in kids ministry, and there's the amount of capacity you have for parking. And then there's a fourth spot that is kind of overlooked, but is just as important, and that's the capacity that you have in the lobby,
Hmm.
because that becomes oftentimes your central gateway through to all those different areas, right? And so, a lot of times the church will say, "Well, we want to make sure we have enough seats for Easter," right? And so they build a sanctuary that's really big, and they don't think about the fact that, hey, guess what? You might actually grow, and you might fill those seats. And if you do, now your kids ministry isn't big enough, and so kids ministry feels uncomfortable and cramped, and you end up knocking through a wall into your office area and kicking all the staff out of the offices so that you get more kids ministry space. And so really kind of thinking through, what are our options here, what are our plans, and making sure that you've got adequate space and all of that. Do you have a plan for when you start to run out of space in your parking lot? Is it in Florida where I live? We just park on the grass. Like that's what everybody does
Hmm.
in Florida. You just park on the grass, and you'll see churches with grass lots, like as their actual strategy. And that's totally acceptable. You can't do that in other parts of the country due to mud or whatever else is going on, or coding. You can't do it. So you got to kind of think through all of those things and have a plan in place so that you know where to go. More often than not, churches will overbuild the sanctuary and underbuild everything else. I don't know exactly what the psychology is there. We could probably do some study on the heart of a pastor, for that, and maybe even do a little bit of soul searching on that. But it is a common problem. And I think what is better to say is, hey, let's just have a plan for how to expand the sanctuary. Let's go ahead and build with the idea that you may jump in with a couple of services right off the bat in that new building. And but you've got enough room for kids ministry and parking along the way. And the lobby, I've seen this too many times where churches get to a point, they get to that dreaded point in every building project that we call value engineering, which is the fancy way
Mm-hmm.
of saying cutting the budget, right? The lobby is the place that almost always gets value engineered, right?
Mm.
Where you'll end up saying, hey, since we've got the sanctuary in the kid space, we can cut the lobby way down and save the budget there. And I've been in, churches that were quite large in terms of their sanctuary size. And then they have these little tiny lobbies and they wonder why everybody leaves 2 minutes after the service ends.
Mm-hmm.
It's because it's so uncomfortable to be there. And so they just leave. And it
Yeah.
really impacts the ability for that church to build real community amongst its people because there is no place to hang around afterwards and enjoy a cup of coffee and talk to your friends who go to your church, right? And so don't skimp on the lobby. If you have to skip somewhere, if you've got to cut the budget somewhere, cut the offices out, right? Cut the staff offices out. I don't care if you have 50 people on your staff.
Yeah.
Cut the offices out and spend 25 grand on really nice furniture around the lobby
Mm-hmm.
and just say, hey guys, you know what? For now, we can't afford offices,
Yep.
but we gave you enough kid space and we gave you enough lobby space and we put lots of chairs for you to sit on.
Yeah.
So it'll be fine. It'll be fine.
Yeah. I've worked with plenty of fast growing, thriving churches that their auditoriums were just not quite big enough and they did not have enough office space. And it's interesting. It feels like the churches that finally build the auditorium that's big enough and they finally have enough office space are usually the churches that are stuck, Phil. So I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
there's a lot of wisdom in all of that. I was really proud of a church that I was working with a few years ago here in Georgia, which, by the way, you can't park in the grass because you would be parking in mud in Georgia. But I referred to them as the largest church I've ever worked with that had the smallest lobby. And I was proud of them because during COVID, they actually invested and prioritized expanding their lobby space. And it really,
Yeah.
on this side of COVID, has set them up for a lot of momentum. So the
Yeah.
reverse side of this mistake then is overbuilding. And where I see this coming into play is when churches build auditoriums for the big holidays like Easter and
Yeah.
Christmas, but then they're never able to fill that space the rest of the year. So can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah. It's definitely a big mistake to overbuild, especially with sanctuary capacity, because it can have a pretty big impact on the morale of the church if you've got a space that you can never fill.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, banks often don't let you do that.
Good.
It used to be that banks would allow that, and they just wouldn't really look too deeply at these things. But they seem to be kind of wising up to the way churches are building, and they're looking a little more deeply. But it affects morale. It means that now, if you need to do, I'm of the belief that churches function better with two services. I realize that there are some that have a theological conviction about doing only one service, and that's fine. But my personal view is that they function better with two services. And that means that you can't think of your sanctuary capacity as just what it is at one service, but what it is
Mm-hmm.
at two services.
Mm-hmm.
And that really then dictates, how big of a room you build. I think there's a way that you can really work well to have a space that does have some flex space for growth or the large Sundays. And that's doing some of the mix of flat floor and then stadium seating. You see this at a number of churches now over the last 5 to 10 years, where you might be able to hold, say, 800 people on a flat surface sanctuary, and then there's kind of a stadium seating effect on the back that gives you another 800 seats, and a curtain can be pulled across all of it, so that when you pull that curtain across, it's an 800 seat room, right?
Yeah.
It's not a 1600 seat room, and maybe you can even do it halfway without opening up all of it. So there's some unique creativity that we'll often bring to a sanctuary design to say, okay, let's take care of your needs now. Let's assume that you've got some growth in you, and let's take care of those needs, and let's do it in a smart way that doesn't make your room feel really empty when
Yeah.
you just haven't grown into it yet. So,
All right. The last mistake I wanted to talk about today is related to story, and seems appropriate talking with someone from Plain Joe and Storyland Studios. But the mistake is around churches not telling the story through design. Can you explain that a little bit?
so everything we do at Plain Joe starts with story, and every good story is going to have three clear aspects to it: character, setting, and plot. I mean, think about it. Every story that's ever been told has characters, it has a setting, and it has a plot. And so the first place that we start with all of our churches is we want to discover that. Again, whether it's a church or a Christian school or a not for profit, we want to come and meet with the key leaders and figure out what your story is. When we understand the story, then we can go from there into all the different aspects of design that we might step into. Let's say we're rebranding you as a church or non for profit. Let's say we are redesigning your existing building or designing a new building or working on a website project, whatever it might be. If it starts with that story, then we can really lean into that carefully. And so if you understand what the story is, then you're able to build all of those design pieces around that. So if you say that you love the traditions of your church and you're in an area that really highly values that, then that ought to be reflected in the design of the building. If you say that you're innovative, if that's part of your stories that you're a super innovative church, then that probably ought to impact the technology that's used in the lobby, right? So each of these things impact the story as we look at how we do design work. And I think if you're not holding to a consistent story, then relatively quickly a space, a building, a home for a church will start to feel disjointed. And you start bringing in pieces, whether it's a piece of furniture or a remodeled part of the building that doesn't tell the same story. It doesn't feel consistent. And so if you've got kind of a roadmap, if you think of that story as the roadmap forward, and everything you do for the next 5 to 10 years kind of heals into that story that you've helped determine and discover, then everything that you design for your spaces, uh, whether they are your physical spaces or your digital spaces, they should all feel like they hang together. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. Phil, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation, just helping us think again about how the spaces that we are building and creating really do impact that weekend experience. So thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Tony. Thank you.
That was a great conversation, Tony. I'm so glad he joined us. You can tell that Phil really has a heart for helping churches in this area. One takeaway that I loved is how Phil said, if we're going to call our churches a church home, we should actually strive to make it feel like a home people can come to and feel comfortable. What stood out to you, Tony?
Yeah, there were quite a few, I thought, very good takeaways from the conversation. The first thing I loved was how Phil framed up this idea of making our physical space warm and inviting as a good gospel thing to do. It takes a lot of courage to show up to a church for the very first time. So it's our job to make it as comfortable as possible and to alleviate the anxiety where we can, whether that's through having enough parking spaces or just making sure it's clear where the bathrooms are, as an example, just trying to remove as
Mm-hmm.
many barriers as we can. The second takeaway for me was that keeping our space updated and fresh doesn't mean having to renovate the entire building. Phil explained how some just new paint and new signage in your common areas can bring a fresh energy to your whole space without needing an entire overhaul. So if we build in those planned refreshes every few years, it doesn't have to be a big financial impact on our ministries. Then the final super practical advice: don't skimp on the lobby. then wonder why no one wants to hang out after the services. Think about how the size and setup of your lobby impacts people's experience at your church, both entering and leaving, and make sure you prioritize that space.
Good stuff. Well, any final thoughts, Tony, before we wrap up today's conversation?
Amy, one of the things Phil really emphasized was putting ourselves in the eyes of a visitor and asking, how does a visitor experience this building? Where do they need to turn? What do they need to find? And while this is something churches can do on their own, it can be really helpful to have a true outsider come in and help you see from this perspective. So if you want to learn more about how our consultants can serve you in that way, you can visit our website and start a conversation at theunstuckgroup.com/start. And you can learn more about PlainJoe. They're a Storyland studio that serves churches at PlainJoeStudios.com.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's podcast. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast and it's helped you in some way, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. And you can do that by subscribing on your favorite podcasting platform, giving us a review, and telling somebody else about the podcast. Next week, we're back with another brand new episode. Until then, have a great week.